there is a hidden reality about the global economy that most governments and financial institutions desperately try to keep under wraps. It's a story not of prosperity and growth, but of secrets, manipulation, and unavoidable collapse cycles linked to choices made behind closed doors. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that the economy is not the straightforward system we're taught in schools or shown in mainstream media. Instead, it is a complex web of power plays, debt traps, and systemic risks poised to snap at any moment. Let's start with one uncomfortable truth. The global economy doesn't function in a vacuum. It's a carefully orchestrated system where governments control the narrative, controlling how money flows, who benefits, and who bears the cost. What they don't want you to know is just how fragile this system actually is, and how close it is to tipping into chaos. Behind the scenes, economic indicators are being masked, inflation numbers understated, and debt figures disguised in layers of financial jargon designed to confuse rather than clarify. Consider the concept of money itself. Most people believe currency is backed by gold or tangible assets, but in reality, since the 1970s, the majority of the world's currencies operate as fiat money. That means their value hinges solely on government promises and trust, not on physical reserves. Take the US dollar, the world's primary reserve currency, whose status gives America unparalleled economic influence. What's often concealed is that the dollar's value has been steadily eroding for decades, largely due to unchecked money printing and ballooning public debt. Why does this matter? Because an over-reliance on a currency whose value is weakening sets a dangerous precedent for the entire globe. Governments borrow more and more, spending heavily on military, welfare, infrastructure, and social programs without immediate means of repayment. This borrowing creates a debt spiral that may seem sustainable on paper, but is fundamentally unsustainable in practice. The fear governments have is that if the public and investors lose faith in their currency, the entire system can unravel almost overnight, triggering a crisis worse than any seen before. Now, let's peel back another layer, the military dimension of economic power. What very few people realize is how much of national budgets are consumed by military spending. It's not just about defense. It's about maintaining global influence, protecting trade routes, and projecting power to keep economic interests secure. This global footprint comes at a staggering cost. When a country, especially one like the United States, spreads itself thin across multiple continents, with hundreds of military bases, it commits to expenses that far outstrip domestic needs. This military overreach impacts the economy in subtle but profound ways. Resources that could fund innovation, education, or infrastructure are siphoned off into perpetuating conflicts and maintaining expensive overseas presences. The government's debt grows, and productivity diminishes as factories close and critical industries move offshore, leaving economies less self-reliant and more vulnerable. It's a cycle that few acknowledge openly, yet it's one of the key drivers behind economic instability. The most alarming secret governments hide is their fear of transparency. A fully transparent economic system would expose the real scale of debt, the extent of currency manipulation, and the unsustainable nature of current spending. This would trigger panic, loss of trust, and rapid withdrawal of investments effects that would cripple markets and economies in the short term. So instead, governments manipulate data, regulate information flow, and push comforting narratives to maintain order. History offers a stark reminder of what happens when these hidden truths finally surface. Empires and superpowers across centuries have followed a similar path, overextending militarily, debasing currency, falling into debt spirals, eroding productive capacity, and ultimately facing social and economic collapse. Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union are grim examples of this cycle in action, each believing their power and wealth were permanent until the cracks became unignorable. We cannot ignore the parallels today. Our current global economy shows the same signs of strain. Military spending remains at historic highs. Public debt is unprecedented, and key manufacturing sectors have hollowed out in many developed countries. Social division and public distrust are deepening, making cooperative reform harder than ever. The situation is precarious, and yet most citizens remain unaware or unconcerned. This brings us to another hidden element, the reserve currency status. Being the issuer of the global reserve currency is a privilege that allows a country to borrow in its own money, keep interest rates artificially low, and demand commodities like oil be priced in its currency. But this status is not guaranteed forever. It depends on trust, economic fundamentals, and geopolitical power. When nations start developing alternatives like new currency blocks or gold-backed arrangements, the grip of the current reserve currency can weaken dramatically. In recent years, significant moves by countries like China, Russia, and members of the BRICS coalition show active efforts to diversify away from the dollar. Central banks are increasing gold reserves, and trade deals are increasingly conducted in alternative currencies. These shifts may seem incremental, but represent a tectonic change in the world's economic order. If this trend accelerates, it will diminish the economic leverage of the United States and ripple across global markets with severe consequences. What governments don't want you to realize is that this economic structure, built on trust, power, and debt, is inherently unstable. Crisis is not a matter of if, but when. The question is how prepared you and your country are for the fallout when the economic landscape dramatically shifts. Understanding these hidden forces is the first step to anticipating what's next, and possibly finding ways to protect wealth and stability amid the coming storm. This video will unpack these secrets, expose the economic mechanisms often hidden from public view, and reveal what the real chances are of avoiding collapse. By understanding the patterns from history and the current economic landscape, viewers can gain a clearer picture of why the future may hold drastic changes and what decisions today are setting the stage for tomorrow's reality. The next thing governments really do not want you to see is how predictable this whole game actually is when you zoom out and look at history. On the surface, every crisis is sold as a shock. No one could have seen this coming. Once-in-a-century event, temporary turbulence. But if you compare the way today's global economy works with how past empires managed their money, their power, and their promises, the pattern is almost copy-paste. The names change, the flags change, the technologies change, but the underlying math and behavior barely move. And that is exactly why this should worry you. Think about what every major power does once it gets comfortable at the top. At first, the rise is built on real productivity, building factories, innovating, trading, educating people, taking calculated risks. But as wealth piles up, something subtle shifts. The priority moves from creating value to protecting status. Instead of asking, how do we build more? Leaders start asking, how do we keep what we have and make sure no one else catches up? That's when the military footprint explodes, the bureaucracy grows, and the financial engineering kicks into overdrive. It's not sold as fear or greed. It's wrapped in words like security, stability, and strategic interest. But the bill always lands on regular people. Now look at how today's big players operate. The United States runs hundreds of military bases around the world and spends more than any other country on defense. China pours money into huge infrastructure and influence projects overseas. The European Union subsidizes entire sectors just to stay competitive. None of this is free. To cover the gap between what they spend and what they actually earn in taxes and real production, governments do the same three things over and over. They borrow, they print, and they promise. They borrow money in the form of bonds. They print money through central banks. And they promise that growth tomorrow will magically pay for excess today. It sounds sophisticated, but strip away the jargon, and it is the same behavior that wrecked past empires. Here's where the part they really avoid talking about comes in. Every shortcut has a cost. When governments print more money than the real economy is producing, prices eventually rise. When they borrow too much, interest payments start eating into everything else: schools, healthcare, infrastructure, even defense. When they rely on other countries for manufacturing, energy, or critical materials, they give up leverage. And when people sense that their wages are not keeping up with prices, while elites seem to be doing just fine, trust begins to crack. You feel it long before you see it on a chart. Higher rents, more side hustles, more anxiety, more anger. One of the clever tools used to keep people calm is how inflation and growth are reported. Official numbers might say, inflation is under control, but that basket of goods they use to measure it rarely looks like your actual life. Housing, healthcare, education, childcare, these big-ticket items climb much faster than the neat headline percentage suggests. At the same time, when governments or media boast about record market highs or strong GDP, they leave out how much of that is driven by cheap money, stock buybacks, or government spending instead of genuine, broad-based prosperity. The result is a disconnect between the story you're told and the reality you live. Another thing that rarely gets explained honestly is how fragile global supply chains make everything. On paper, it looks efficient. One country makes the chips, another makes the phones, another refines the oil, another ships the goods. But what that really means is that one disruption, a war, a pandemic, a shipping bottleneck, a financial shock can trigger price spikes and shortages worldwide almost overnight. Governments talk about resilience, yet for decades they encouraged businesses to chase the cheapest labor and lowest taxes instead of stability. When shelves go empty or prices jump 30 to 40% in a year, the blame gets put on some convenient villain, not on the long chain of decisions that made the system this fragile in the first place. Underneath all of this sits the question almost nobody in power wants to answer directly. What happens when the world starts to lose faith in the current financial order? If enough countries stop trusting a reserve currency, stop rolling over debt, or stop believing that bonds from certain governments are truly risk-free, the shift will be violent. Interest rates can spike, currencies can plunge, stock markets can tank. Governments can suddenly find themselves unable to fund basic operations without resorting to even more printing, which only makes the currency weaker. This is the nightmare scenario the public has never walked through step by step, because once people understand it, they start asking harder questions about policy choices being made right now. And yet, here's the twist. This isn't meant to paralyze you with fear. It's meant to snap you out of the illusion that everything is fine, because the experts said so. Governments rely on that passivity. If people assume the system is too complex to understand, they stop paying attention and just hope for the best. But you don't need a PhD to recognize patterns. You can see when your cost of living rises faster than your income. You can see when your country produces less and imports more. You can see when leaders keep promising change, but the same problems deepen year after year. Those observations are not conspiracy theories, they're data points from real life. The truth is, once you accept that the global economy is in the late stages of a familiar pattern, your perspective shifts. News headlines stop feeling random and start fitting into a bigger story. Currency disputes, trade wars, sanctions, debt ceilings, stimulus packages, they all become chapters in the same book about a system stretching beyond its limits. And that gives you power, because you're no longer just reacting emotionally to each crisis. You're able to anticipate what kinds of shocks are likely and how governments will probably respond. More money printing, more emergency measures, more spin. In the next part, we're going to connect this big picture directly to your day-to-day life, your savings, your job, your investments, and your future choices. Because if governments won't tell you how this ends, you at least deserve to understand the playbook they are silently following, and how you can start writing your own. When you hear about global debt, currency wars, or recession risks on the news, it can sound distant, like something that matters only to politicians, Wall Street, or big corporations. But this is where the biggest lie lives. The global economy is not some abstract machine operating far above your head. It shows up in your rent, in your paycheck, in your grocery bill, in your job security, and in the value of every dollar you save. When governments quietly choose more debt, more money printing, and more overreach, they're not just gambling with the system. They're gambling with your future. Start with your savings. If you keep your money in cash or basic bank accounts, inflation is the invisible tax you pay every single year. When governments flood the system with new money to paper over problems, the price of everything you actually need, food, fuel, housing, healthcare, creeps higher. Your salary might go up a little, but rarely as fast as your expenses. Over time, that gap compounds. What you could have afforded 10 years ago feels out of reach today. That isn't bad luck. It's the direct result of policies that favor borrowing and spending over discipline and productivity. Then look at your job. In a world where governments and corporations chase cheap labor and short-term profits, entire industries can vanish from your country in a single decade. Factories close, offices downsize. Automation and outsourcing take over. Leaders call it efficiency or global competitiveness, but for the average worker, it means less bargaining power, more job insecurity, and a constant pressure to do more for less. When the bigger economic cycle turns downward, when recessions hit or debt bubbles pop, those same workers are the first to feel the pain through layoffs, hiring freezes, and wage cuts. Your investments are caught in this too. Whether you invest in stocks, real estate, crypto, or just a retirement fund, you're riding on waves created by central banks and government policy. Ultra-low interest rates, massive stimulus, and easy credit push asset prices higher, making people feel richer on paper. But the higher those prices drift away from real economic value, the more violent the snapback can be when confidence cracks. A single policy change, a surprise rate hike, a geopolitical shock, suddenly markets can plunge, leaving unprepared investors exposed. This is why understanding the pattern isn't just interesting, it's survival. When you know governments are likely to respond to every crisis with the same toolkit: print more, borrow more, promise more, you can stop being shocked and start being strategic. Instead of assuming your currency will always hold its value, you can think about diversifying. Different asset classes, different income streams, maybe even exposure to different regions. Instead of counting on a single employer or a single skill set, you can invest in adaptability, learning, networking, building things that are valuable no matter what the headline says. Here's the part no one in power will spell out clearly. Systems this stretched rarely glide gently into a soft landing. Sometimes the change comes as a slow grind, years of stagnant wages, creeping prices, and fading opportunities. Other times it arrives faster: market crash, a currency shock, a wave of defaults, a political crisis that shatters trust overnight. In both cases, the people who do best are the ones who stopped believing the official story early enough to prepare. They reduced bad debt. They built emergency savings. They learned how money actually works. They stayed alert instead of distracted. None of this means you should panic or run for the hills. Panic is just as useful to the system as blind trust, because scared people make impulsive decisions. The goal is clarity. Once you see the global economy for what it really is, a leveraged, politically managed, deeply interconnected network, you can start asking smarter questions. How exposed is your life to one currency, one government, one employer, one industry, one country? What would happen to you if your cost of living jumped another 20%? If your income dropped for 6 months? If your home value fell instead of rose? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're exactly the questions leaders avoid encouraging you to ask. And this circles back to why governments prefer you focused on short-term distractions instead of long-term patterns. If enough people realized how far along the cycle we really are, how much debt is already baked in, how inflated many asset prices are, how frayed global trust has become, they might demand real reforms. They might push for honest budgets, sound money, investment in real production, instead of endless financial engineering. They might reject narratives that say there is no alternative and start building new ones. Will that happen in time? No one can say. Maybe the system limps along for another decade, patched and propped up by new tricks. Maybe one shock, financial, political, or geopolitical, pushes it over the edge much sooner. What is certain is that waiting for a perfect warning bell is a mistake. Crises are always impossible right up until the week they happen. Afterward, everyone suddenly claims they saw it coming. You don't need to be one of those people. You're seeing the pattern now. So, when you hear officials say, the fundamentals are strong, or the situation is under control, Remember the three empires that thought the exact same thing right before their fall. Remember how every collapsing system clung to denial until the very end. And then remember that you still have a choice. You can either live inside their narrative, hoping they manage the decline gracefully, or step outside it. Learn how the game is really played, and start quietly positioning yourself for whatever comes next. Because, at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about governments and the global economy. It's a story about you. Your money, your time, your future. They may not want you to see the full picture, but now you do. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.